Hi, everybody. I'm Pastor Megan from Grace Lutheran.
I'm Michaela.
Yeah. And Michaela, today we're going to tell people a little bit about what bias is. Do you know what bias is?
No.
Bias is when people are prejudiced to someone. Do you know what prejudice means?
No.
Prejudice is when someone unfairly likes someone else or likes someone because of the color of their skin, what country they were born in, what religion they practice, who they love, or how they talk about their pronouns, what kind of gender they are. So, like, what if only girls could be doctors?
That's mean.
Yeah. What if only boys could be doctors?
That's so mean.
Yeah. Why is it an important thing for us to talk about, do you think?
About what?
Remember, you were telling me about the differences between white people and black people back in the day. Remember, we've been learning about that. We've been talking about Sojourner Truth and Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
Will you tell them a little bit about it, and then you can go back and play?
Martin, he is black, and he died.
Mm-hmm. But what did he do before he died?
I forgot. He told people to get along.
Yeah. Yep.
And he did a lot of speeches.
I remember he tried to go on that march.
Yeah.
What happened when he tried to march to Selma?
They're white people.
Were they nice?
No.
Yeah, they hurt people, didn't they? Mm-hmm. So we keep on working on telling people that they are beautiful. Did you know that black is beautiful?
Mm-hmm.
How?
You told me.
Oh, yeah, it's true. All right. Thank you, Michaela. You want to say goodbye to everybody?
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
You.
Love you.
All right. Have fun playing. So that's a little bit about why this is important to me. Is I am a parent of children who are black. Dominique's in the other room working on language arts. We are stuck in the house during the self-quarantine here in San Francisco, and what a great time to learn a little bit more about things. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is helping people learn about bias, and this is a really great book if you haven't ever read it before. It's by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, and she talks about bias, and she's a psychologist, so she talks about why our brains categorize people and what are some of the harmful effects that have happened when we categorize people. What are the ways that these can become biases? So the first kind of terminology to learn when you're thinking about bias is the difference between implicit bias and explicit bias. Implicit bias, well, let's start with explicit bias. Explicit bias is a little bit like what Michaela was talking about. It's really overt biases that people, they know they have them, they are expressing them, and they're choosing not to fix them. So explicit biases are things that we used to refer to and still refer to as racism, sexism, basically anything that ends in an ism that's bad. Terms like homophobic is the idea that people are overtly biased against people because of their LGBTQ status or because of their gender. And so this is just it's not really new, but maybe more just that every generation has different terminology about how they talk about these issues. So bias is the academic model that people are using now. Explicit bias, again, is when you know you're biased and you choose to keep your bias. Implicit bias is when you don't know that you have a bias. So all of us have ways that we live our life. If we've grown up in the United States, we might just not know enough about how people do things in India. And that might mean that because we don't know enough, we have biases that we carry inside of us. We might have biases about the proper way to push a grocery cart in a grocery store. And those biases might change when there is a health emergency, or those biases might change if we have kids and now we have a different way of seeing the world for other people who have kids. Implicit biases don't remain implicit biases once someone points them out to you. So if someone gives you feedback and says, wow, you should really work on this because we don't say it that way anymore, or you shouldn't treat people like this, or you should review your policies and procedures because those aren't best practices anymore. That's kind of some of the nice ways that people point that out. Some of the harder ways that people might point that out is to be like, you're racist because you used this particular word, or because you acted in this particular way. And that is something that if it has ever happened to you and it caused you to have feelings about it, a book that I recommend is called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I'm going to put a link to all of the recommended readings down here and some additional ones, particularly if you're Lutheran and you want to read about some of the social statements that also talk about bias in lots of different spheres. White fragility is a way of trying to talk about how it feels when you get feedback that you have an implicit bias, that you are doing something that's out of sync with the way other people might want to be treated. It specifically is trying to talk about how if you immediately have your first response as no, yuck, ugh, or something that emotionally shows that you're not in a culture that's really good at accepting feedback or accepting criticism and then working on yourself. That's something that is now being talked about as fragility. If you've ever been to a talk on bias where people have said, you need to work on your own issues, it's not my job to educate you, it comes out of this idea that putting all of the emotional work onto people who come from various intersections that might be treated in difficult ways in our society is unkind, unhelpful, additionally burdensome, and that it's the work of those who have more privileges to work on themselves and to try to decrease the implicit biases that they have. So if you've ever heard that, or you've just heard other people say it, and then you thought, yeah, but who's going to teach me if I have to do this work for myself? Ta-da, you're watching this video, and so clearly you have taken a step to work on this, and hopefully I'll give you a couple of ways that you can decrease each of the types of bias that I'll talk to you about today. So implicit bias. Explicit bias is a bias, remember, that someone has chosen to keep. So we're going to assume that that kind of person doesn't want to make their life better. For the most part, most people, once they've had time to think about it, once they've had time to adjust, once they learn what the best practice words are to say, most people will go, yeah, I want you to feel loved by me. And so I'm going to learn what these new words are. We might be a little frustrated or grumpy with ourselves that it's hard sometimes to learn the words, and we might not know where to go to learn the words. We might want people to be kind when they teach us which words we should figure out. But there are ways that you can explicitly work on that. One is a really great resource from the General Commission on Religion and Race. I think it's a part of the Methodist tradition. And it's an actual workbook that allows you to work on implicit bias. And even better, it has a whole curriculum. There's an online curriculum that you can take from your house, just like you're watching this video. You could take the online curriculum to learn more about implicit bias. But it also has things like instruction guides, how you can preach on this in your congregation. Because there are ways in which bias affects us individually. There are the ways that I think and feel. But bias also lives in organizations. So there's the ways that the policies, the procedures, the rituals, the practices that we do in organizations and in faith communities also can have biases. So I could do all my own personal work, but if church policies in the building I work in don't also try to work on decreasing their biases, then I am a part of that structure. Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes about that a lot in his book Sanctorum communio, in this idea that God sees our behaviors in the world, sees our ethics in the world in a really complex way, and that we can be doing a really great job individually, right? God can be like, you're good, great faith life, but we're a part of a country that's acting inappropriately, right? Bonhoeffer's writing from the context of Germany, you know, pre-World War I Holocaust, right? And so you can be tangled up in systems of injustice or organizations that have implicit biases that we have to work on how to untangle them. And how do we untangle them? Curriculums like this help. There's also some really great literature, strategies for confronting unconscious bias in lots of different professions that will help you kind of take an assessment, a moral assessment. In the same way that you might have a checklist of stuff you want to take when you go on a trip, you can do a moral assessment of ways that you want to decrease your bias. There's also some really good handbooks that come from educators about how to teach information about bias. This one comes from Perspectives for a Diverse America. And again, I'll put the link down here if you want to read any of these materials to work on your own biases. So do you remember so far? Explicit bias is a bias I know about and I want to keep it, right? Implicit bias is a bias I don't even know I have. It's unconscious. For some people, this is, they decide all Prius drivers are bad drivers. They decide based on whatever their life experience is that winter is terrible or winter is wonderful, right? Whatever sort of ways that our brain has connected things together and made them into patterns that we now believe and we carry with us. These biases then can become costly for different groups and communities, particularly if we write these biases into policy, if we don't even realize or put it together explicitly that we're paying this group of people more than we're paying this group of people, or maybe we think this group of people should have to do most of the manual labor and this group of people should not. This group of people should have access to healthcare quickly. This group of people should not. And all of the factors that go into that is triaging, right? But when it affects certain groups more than others, particularly groups that are disadvantaged racially, when it happens over a really long period of time, it costs some communities more than it costs others. And so the language around that is privilege. So the more society's biases or organizational biases help to build up certain individuals, they're thought to be people who have a lot of privilege. And the more policies and procedures make it difficult for other communities based on the different criteria that they have, those people are sometimes talked about as being vulnerable or on the margins, folk who could do with privileges being shared in a different way. How do we really atone for this if an organization has been doing it for a really long time? Well, then there's truth-telling processes. This is the truth and racial reconciliation and truth-telling document that is written by cops. It's for police departments. So you can imagine when there are unjust laws that have been enacted over long periods of time, and then those laws change, police practices change. There's a truth and reconciliation process where law enforcement communities can apologize for what's happened. And so that's kind of the model that I'm going to encourage people to follow, is when you have an implicit bias and someone gives you feedback about it, take their feedback seriously. I have a personal rule that if someone gives me the same feedback 3 times, it could be different people, but if I get the same feedback 3 times, even if I think it's the worst feedback ever, I take it seriously and I learn about how to be better in that area. It doesn't mean that if someone gives me really biased feedback, if someone is biased towards me, that I take all of their feedback in all of their stereotypes, or if someone's really kind of being unjust in their feedback, I still take that into consideration. But what I do is I assess, well, if people believe that about me, and I know that's not my intention or that's not what I'm trying to do, how can I learn more to be a better communicator? And so what I might do is have continuing education that helps me communicate my heart to people who are not understanding my heart. And so you can set your own rule for how often you want to get feedback before you take it seriously. You might have certain individuals that, like, if this person gives me feedback 100% of the time, I trust it, I believe it. But you really do have to pay attention that you're not only getting feedback from one type of person, because there are particular biases that can come out that way. There's two of them. One is called in-group bias. In-group bias means that I trust the opinions of people who are like me, people I'm familiar with, or people who are already a part of the group over other people's feedback. So that means if, for example, I am a part of a congregation and all the people in the congregation love one particular hymn, I might say something like, everyone loves this hymn. And then a visitor comes and they really don't like that hymn. Or there are a group of people who would love to worship with us if only we would stop singing that hymn. Or the words in the hymn are harmful or hurtful to a community that doesn't worship with us. How do we figure out when we have in-group bias and when we don't have in-group bias? Some of the recommendations is that people intentionally solicit outside feedback. One of the ways that I do that is, in addition to those who are worshiping in our physical space, we also post a lot of things on Facebook and get feedback from individuals. And sometimes it's opposite feedback of people who are in the community physically. And then I try to share that feedback with as many people as possible. So the more you can diversify the people you trust and the kinds of people you trust, the more you can diversify who you're getting information from, the more you can decrease this in-group bias. In-group bias is also difficult because on social networking, because there are these algorithms, these fancy math equations, they will try to send us content that agrees with us. That's from people like us. So you have to intentionally, in those communities, if you want diverse feedback or you want to know how a community that's very different than you is, you need to research those communities and then follow their public information. This is a thing you can do on Twitter, although Twitter can be difficult because sometimes it's a little more grumpy than some other online sharing spaces. But the beautiful thing about Twitter is that you could research people of a completely different race in a completely different part of the world and just listen to what their thoughts are. And so if you haven't done this, I recommend that you diversify your social networking streams so that you are getting more diverse feedback, and hopefully that will decrease in-group bias. Confirmation bias is another type of bias that can happen if you have the same types of people. Confirmation bias also can happen on an individual level. Confirmation bias is when I believe a narrative, right? My brain has created all these pathways. It's found patterns and it's put them together. And in order to have calm in my life, my brain then looks for confirmation that everything I believe is true. So if when I walk outside these doors, every time I'm looking around, I go, see, I was right. And all I ever am noticing in the world around me is when I'm right, and I disregard any information that says I should work on myself or that I'm not right. That's called confirmation bias, right? If you only survey people who already like you, the results will be that you're doing everything right. Hooray, we're doing great. Does this mean that you need to intentionally seek out the negative? No, but it does mean that you should try to learn more balanced information about groups of people you have a hard time liking. What this means is if you have written off a particular profession, say you hate ocean fishermen. I'm coming up with a bizarre example that I don't think very many people are against because I don't want it to feel like I'm picking on any group of people or I'm trying to say that they're insensitive or that they're unkind, because God loves everybody. So the book of Matthew says that whatever measurement I use to judge other people is the same measurement Jesus is going to use on me. And I take that to mean if I say you're all good and we're all doing the best we can, then hopefully Jesus will look at me one day and say, you're all good. You're doing the best you can, right? So, but what my recommendation is, if you are someone who has a group of people that you don't understand yet, that you don't know much about, that you intentionally seek a way to learn more about that. And the wonderful thing is that with YouTube, with Netflix, you can really glimpse into a portion of people's lives by watching reality TV. So if I was against deep sea fishermen, I could go and watch a reality show about how hard and dangerous it is to be a deep sea fisherman. I could learn about what their pains and what their sorrows are. I could relate with some of the ways that they are fully human like me. And hopefully, by not only reading bad things about fishermen, I can balance out how I feel about them. So know that it's not the work of a community that I'm against to convince me not to be against them. It's my work to counter my own confirmation bias by reading balanced information about people. And so this is a weird practice, but if you're Lutheran like me, Martin Luther used to have a saying that everyone is simultaneously saint and sinner. Gandhi had a similar saying where he said, all people hold a little bit of the truth and a little bit of the untruth. And you can believe that the person you're against is mostly untruth and you're mostly truth. But that person still has a little bit of the truth you need to learn from. And so Gandhi believed that we had to be in relationship even with people we don't like because we could learn from them. And that was kind of our purpose in the world. And so if you are seeing someone only as sinner or only as a saint, then you just need to balance out the information you're getting from them. Because most of us are in those middle spaces, right? And so that is how you can counter your confirmation bias, is just to learn more things and to try to balance out your information. So that might mean changing up what media you read, or changing up your Facebook accounts, or finding ways that you can care for people that are just simply by learning about them. When I was working with homeless youth, for example, I would read PerezHilton.com. I would learn about gossip about celebrities because it gave me a way to have conversations with them. And the more that I would kind of learn about the things that they cared about, the more they felt cared for. So think about this as learning about what a diverse group cares about so that you can be better at loving them. Another type of bias that's really important to learn about is called hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is something that's very prevalent in our world today. Hindsight bias is when you think of a problem that happened in the past and you have the luxury of not being stressed out about the emergency. You have the luxury of Googling any of the facts you need to figure out. You have the luxury of time and distance. You're not emotionally connected to what's happened. You can really have great advice for what that person should have done in the past. When the reality was that whatever actions they took, they didn't have the same amount of time. They didn't have endless ability to research what the best solutions were. They had stress probably that was limiting their vision, both their literal vision and their figurative vision. And this hindsight bias is what you might notice when everyone hates everything, or when people say, that's not how I would have done it. Or thinking things just really are easier. And this happens a lot in critique of first responders. As someone who is a chaplain for the San Francisco Police Department, I noticed this quite a bit. Not speaking for the police department, obviously, but it's very easy to critique a first responder when you're not in the emergency. It's very easy to critique how someone coordinated their disaster response with the luxury of all the time and the resources and the funding, and knowing how it's going to end, right? A lot of us would behave differently if we knew for certain how this was all going to end. And so be really careful at how quickly you have decided that you know a better way someone should have behaved in the past, unless you're a parent and then do this all the time, because parents like me totally know all the answers about how their kids could have made safer, healthier choices, and why are they screaming all the time? I don't know. Anyway, that's just a funny way of saying we all have all of these at some point in our life. Some of the ways that we carry these biases don't affect other people very often. It's just the curmudgeonness that's kind of in our brain. But in other ways, the ways that we carry these biases really have a profound, lasting impact. So the thing that might feel like small and insignificant might be someone else's microaggression. Microaggression is a way of saying just these tiny little things that chip away at you. If you are a person who is vulnerable or a person who lives at the intersections, these little microaggressions chip away with you and give you the sense that you are less. They decrease your self-esteem. They have a psychological effect, and they have an emotional effect. They might have a larger consequence, which is that people might not ask for raises because they've been told over and over and over through these tiny little instances that they are not valued as much. So even if we can tone down our bias in these tiny little ways, it can end up having a longer effect, because we just have no idea. The person we accidentally call the wrong pronoun might have had 15 other things that happened that day, and that's just the last straw for them. So that reaction, that is, you got to change, your language is all wrong, or whatever way that feedback comes out that makes us feel a bit fragile, might be because we didn't see the 18 other times that this happened to someone. Or we might be the safest person who acted in a biased way towards someone, and so we're the one who has the shoulders who can take it, right? And then the final type of bias that I want to talk about is called bias by proxy. Bias by proxy is when the best example of this is if someone calls into the 911 system and they, for the purpose of getting someone in trouble, exaggerate what's happening in a biased manner, then they call, and because it's on the 911 system, first responders have to check out every phone call that happens. Because even if someone is super racist and it's really obvious that they're racist on the phone, they still might be right that there's an emergency and someone might need care, right? And so first responders have to check out everything that comes into the 911 system. But what that means is when a first responder might go to care for someone who was called in for something that was biased, the police are now being used to live out a bias by proxy. Someone else's bias is embodied in this first responder now. In the best case scenario about this, the first responder might check out that everything is going okay, and then might have the opportunity to do some education with the person who called in something in a biased way and help them understand that they should be a little bit less biased. But in worst case scenario, this can really impact lives, right? There are instances of bias by proxy where people, particularly if we think in the let's think of things that happen in the Wayback Machine, because sometimes it's a little easier to talk about them without triggering people. But back in the day, when Black individuals in the South would be blamed for whatever crime that happened, that some of that still happens, but happen in really tragic ways, like just lynching people based on that one accusation. And so bias by proxy can be deadly, would be the way to say that. Bias by proxy also can happen in those tiny microaggression ways. So everything from those tiny little microaggressions to things that are really deadly. And these are some of the most dangerous things that we should be looking at in our employee handbooks to try to root out biases. In our policies and procedures, particularly in the church world, we have all these great documents that have called us to do things. This is the ELCA's social message on gender-based violence. And in the back of this book, on page 18, it says, what should we do? And there's a 3-page list of things synods were supposed to have done. This document was written in 2015. You want to guess how many synods did all the things in this list? Wah, wah. So if you're a part of the Sierra Pacific Synod, there's a resolution going forward that's going to ask the Synod to work to decrease bias using some of these documents that have existed for way longer than it feels appropriate to not have done them. And if you're interested, that resolution is posted on justlutheran.org. You can copy it and use it in your Synod assembly too, if you'd like to have something like that. So that's a lot of different types of biases. Do you remember what they all are? Explicit bias. Explicit bias is when you know you're biased, you don't decide to fix it, and you just keep it. Implicit bias is when you don't know that you have a bias. It also can be called unconscious bias, right? You don't know that you're saying the wrong word, that you're doing the wrong thing, that you're having an impact. As soon as you find out, though, you either have to work on it to decrease it, or it is an explicit bias that you're keeping. Confirmation bias is when everything you see matches that narrative that you carry and you disregard all evidence that is outside of your bias. In-group bias is when you are only taking feedback from people like you or people who you already trust and disregarding any feedback from people who are outside of your group. So information that only comes from your Facebook feed is correct, right? Hindsight bias is when you think the actions in the past are super easy to have fixed. I can't believe they didn't fix it this way. I have all this time and information and I'm not stressed out. So I totally know the right answer. And whoever that person was in the past should have also known the right answer. Hindsight bias can be a real tough one. And then bias by proxy, which is when someone else's bias gets reported and has to be acted on by other people, and that bias is lived out in a new way. So I hope that you will do what you can, check out the resources below and that are linked on virtualgrace.org or at justlutheran.org. And there's a lot of ways you can decrease these biases. And the great news is learning about them really is the first step. I love you guys. Take care. Stay safe. And if you have the opportunity, use this time to learn a little bit about cultures you don't understand, or people you don't understand, so that you can love bigger, better, and more often. But remember, even if you don't, God still loves you. Take care, everybody.